The desert sun burned without mercy, a relentless fire that seemed determined to erase every trace of life left on the barren land. Wind carried only dust and the dry whisper of forgotten bones, scattered like broken promises across the plains. 4. Cowboys rode in silence, their horses slow and steady, the rhythm of hooves the only sound keeping them company. They were men hardened by the West, molded by loneliness and death. Yet that afternoon, something unusual waited on the road ahead. A figure staggered into view, a woman. Her steps were crooked, wavering, as if each movement was a fight against the earth itself. Her dress hung in torn shreds, stained with dried blood. A straw hat drooped loosely over her head, shielding nothing from the punishing sun. Her skin glistened with sweat, but what drew their eyes was her hand, shaking, pressing against her belly where the dark mark of a bullet still lived. Inside her, she did not cry out. She did not beg. She only kept walking, as if carried forward by some invisible thread, unwilling to fall until her body gave no other choice. The cowboys exchanged glances. One turned his head away. Another spat in the dust. The third gave a low, humorless laugh, as if the sight was nothing more than another cruel memory to add to the countless others. To them, she was no kin, no business, no profit. Just another ghost on the trail. But the fourth cowboy stopped. His horse snorted as he pulled the reins tight, staring at the woman who seemed half shadow, half human in the rising veil of dust. Her chest heaved unevenly, life dangling by a thread. He swung his leg over and stepped down. "Ma'am?" His voice was low, almost ashamed, as if he didn't want the others to hear it. One of his companions muttered over his shoulder, "Leave her. She's dead anyway." But the cowboy didn't move. He walked toward her, slow and careful, the way one approaches a wounded animal that might bite. Her knees buckled, and before she hit the ground, she collapsed against him. Her weight was slight, but the heat of her blood seeped through his shirt, warm and real. The others kept riding, their silhouettes fading into the horizon. Not once looking back, he lifted her into his arms, carried her to his horse, and mounted with her resting against his chest. His canteen held barely enough water for himself. He knew every extra mile with her would steal his strength, maybe even his life, but the West always collects the debts of a man's choices, and his choice was made. The horse's hooves struck the earth with a dull rhythm, a drumbeat echoing through the vast silence of the desert. The cowboy rode with the woman slumped in his arms, her breath shallow, uneven, like a candle flame flickering against the wind. Every few minutes her head shifted slightly, pressing against his chest, but her eyes never opened. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky with fire, but the heat still clung to the air, heavy and merciless. His throat was dry, his tongue thick, and the canteen at his side rattled almost hollow. He knew he couldn't waste much on her. Still, he tipped a few drops past her cracked lips, watching as she swallowed weakly. "Don't die on me," he muttered under his breath. It was not a plea, not even compassion. It was defiance. The trail grew lonelier with every mile. The other cowboys were long gone, swallowed by distance and indifference. Now there was only him, the woman, and the weight of a choice that already pressed harder than the desert sun. When he reached the dry riverbed, he dismounted. The place had once carried water, maybe months ago, maybe years. Now it was just cracked mud, lizards scuttling across it like thieves. He laid her down carefully in the shade of a bent cottonwood, the only tree stubborn enough to keep its roots here. Kneeling beside her, he checked the wound. The bullet had gone in deep, torn through flesh and muscle, but not clean. Blood oozed when he pressed the edge of her dress aside. Her face twisted faintly, pain written even in her unconsciousness. He cursed under his breath. Without water, without whiskey, without fire, there was no way to clean it. Infection would come fast, faster than her strength could hold. A buzzard circled overhead. Then another. The cowboy looked up, eyes narrowing. "Not yet," he whispered to the sky, as if warning the carrion birds themselves. He searched the dry ground for signs of water. The sand was loose, but at the lowest dip of the bed he dug with his hands, until his nails were raw, until damp soil clung to his fingers. He dug deeper, until a trickle of muddy water began to gather. He let it fill, cupping it carefully in his palms, carrying it back to her lips. She stirred when the water touched her mouth. Her eyelids fluttered, and for the first time he saw. Her eyes clouded, feverish but alive, her lips parted, and a whisper scraped out, "Why?" He didn't answer. He only pressed the water to her mouth again, making sure she drank. Then he heard it. Hoofbeats, far off, but closing. The cowboy's hand went to his revolver. He stood slowly, scanning the horizon. Through the haze of dust came 3 riders. They weren't his companions. These men wore bandanas over their faces, rifles slung across their backs. And even from a distance he knew the kind. They had left this woman bleeding in the dirt, certain she'd be carrion before sunset. But she wasn't. Not yet. The cowboy crouched beside her, his voice low and steady. "Listen to me. Whoever you are, whatever happened, they're coming back. And if they find you alive, they'll finish the job." Her eyes met his, desperate, wild, and filled with a truth he could almost read. She wanted to live, but fear told her death might come sooner. He reloaded his revolver, snapped the chamber shut, and positioned himself between her and the approaching riders. The desert wind stirred, carrying with it the promise of blood. The West always takes its toll, and tonight it had already chosen its battleground. The riders came slow, deliberate, the way wolves circle prey that can't yet escape. Their silhouettes grew sharper against the sinking sun, faces still hidden behind dust and bandanas. Each man carried himself with the calm weight of killers, who had done this before, too many times to count. The cowboy knelt beside the woman once more, his hand steadying her shoulder. "Stay low. Don't move," he whispered. Her breath rattled, her hand clutching weakly at his sleeve. He saw the fear in her eyes, but there was something else too. Recognition. She knew those men. The riders drew closer, stopping a dozen yards away. The lead man lifted his bandana, revealing a scar carved deep across his cheek, a pale line that cut through tanned skin like lightning frozen in flesh. He spat into the dirt, his eyes locking on the wounded woman. "Hell," he said, his voice gravel. "And venom. Thought we left you to the buzzards." The cowboy rose to his feet, hand on his revolver. His stance was calm, legs planted, every inch of him daring them to make a move. "She's still breathing," he said evenly. The scarred man grinned, showing teeth stained with tobacco. "Not for long." The others chuckled, spurring their horses forward a step. Dust swirled around them, catching the last light of day. The cowboy didn't flinch. He thumbed back the hammer of his Colt. "Then you'll have to ride through me." A heavy silence fell. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The woman's eyes widened as she watched the standoff, her lips trembling with words she couldn't yet form. The scarred man leaned forward on his saddle. "You don't even know who she is, do you?" The cowboy's jaw tightened. "Don't matter." "Oh, it matters plenty," the man sneered. "That little viper there. She stole from us. Thought she was clever. Thought she could run. Put a bullet in her gut so she'd learn slow." He grinned wider. "Still breathing means we didn't teach her enough." Behind him, one of the others laughed, pulling his rifle free from its sling. The metallic sound carried sharp in the dry air. The cowboy drew. The crack of the revolver split the silence, a flash of fire spitting from the barrel. The rider with the rifle jerked, toppled sideways, and hit the ground with a hollow thud. His horse bolted, scattering dust into the twilight. Chaos erupted. The second outlaw swung his carbine up, firing wild. Bullets tore through the cottonwood, splinters raining down. The cowboy rolled, firing again. His shot caught the man in the chest, ripping him backward off his horse. The scarred leader roared, his pistol already out. He fired once, twice. One bullet cut through the cowboy's sleeve. Another sparked off a stone. The cowboy crouched, steady, returning fire. The two men exchanged shots until smoke hung heavy, the acrid stench of powder filling the air. The scarred outlaw wheeled his horse, circling, trying to flank. The cowboy advanced, step by deliberate step, his revolver steady. Their eyes locked, hatred against resolve. Finally, the cowboy's shot found its mark. The scarred man's chest jerked, his body swaying in the saddle before sliding limp in two. The desert fell quiet again. The only sounds were the woman's ragged breaths and the faint cry of a buzzard overhead. The cowboy holstered his gun, his heart pounding, but his face unreadable. He walked back to the woman, kneeling beside her once more. Her eyes were wide, shining with something raw, relief, fear, gratitude, and a shadow of guilt. They were the ones, she whispered, her voice thin as smoke. They burned my home. They killed my kin. Tears streaked her dusty face. I took from them only what they had stolen first. Gold, horses, but it wasn't enough. They wanted me to suffer. The cowboy listened, silent, his hand resting lightly on the grip of his Colt. You should have left me, she whispered. They'll come. More of them. He glanced at the bodies cooling in the dirt, then at the horizon stretching. Endless and empty, maybe, he said quietly. But you're still breathing. That means the West ain't done with you yet. He lifted her again, settling her carefully against the saddle. Her weight sagged into him, but she was alive. And as he mounted, the dying sun painted the sky in red and gold, colors that looked too much like blood to be comforting. The trail ahead was long, and somewhere beyond it, vengeance waited. The desert had grown colder as night fell, a sharp contrast to the relentless sun that had beaten down hours before. Shadows stretched long, stretching across the cracked earth like dark fingers reaching for them. The cowboy rode slowly, the woman slumped against him, breathing shallow but steady. Every so often she shifted, pressing her hand to her belly as if the pain would remind her she was still alive. He kept a steady pace, glancing at the horizon, listening to the whisper of the wind through the dry brush. Somewhere out there, the outlaws might still be following, but for now, the desert was theirs. The woman stirred, opening her eyes fully. For the first time since he had lifted her, "Who are you?" she asked, voice hoarse, almost a whisper. Just a man, he said, keeping his eyes forward, scanning the darkness. One who doesn't like to see someone die when it's not. The time, her lips quivered, a faint smile touching the corner. You saved me, even after everything I've done. He didn't answer. Words were useless here. Actions mattered. That's what the West taught you. That's what life demanded. Hours passed. They found a small creek, hidden behind a cluster of jagged rocks. Water trickled clear and cold, a rare gift in the barren land. He set her down gently, letting her sip slowly, watching as her strength began to return, little by little. I never thought anyone would stop, she whispered, tears running freely now, streaking the dust from her face. They all left. Everyone leaves. He crouched beside her, keeping one hand on his revolver, the other brushing the damp hair from her forehead. Not everyone, he said quietly. Some of us. We pay attention. We do what's right, even if it costs us. She looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time there was trust there, but also fear. They both knew the danger wasn't over. The men she had crossed were ruthless, and she had taken from them what they would kill to reclaim. Then, what now? She asked, voice trembling. He stood slowly, keeping his eyes on the horizon. Now we survive. We get you back on your feet. Then we make sure they don't follow. She nodded weakly, leaning on him as he guided her back to the saddle. Together they rode into the night, shadows blending with the darkness around them, the stars above, cold witnesses to their flight. Hours turned into the next day. The woman began to speak more, revealing her past. A family torn apart by greed and violence, a home burned to the ground, a life stolen piece by piece. And through it all she had survived, not because of luck, but because she had learned to move silently, strike when needed, and trust almost no one. The cowboy listened, understanding that the woman's strength was not in her body, but in her will. And in the West, willpower often mattered more than skill with a gun. When they finally stopped near a small settlement, hidden away in a canyon, he helped her down. She stood unsteadily, brushing the dust from her dress. "Thank you," she said, voice steadier now. "I don't know how to repay you." He gave a faint nod, looking past her to the open desert. "Live," he said simply. "That's enough." And for the first time in weeks, the woman felt the possibility of life instead of just survival. The cowboy mounted his horse again, tipping his hat back slightly. He had chosen to stop, to carry her when no one else would. And in doing so, he had reminded both of them that even in the cruel, ruthless West, there were still choices that could save a life. The wind whispered through the canyon, carrying dust and distant memories, and the sun rose slowly over the horizon. A new day, a chance to continue. They had survived the desert, the bullets, the men who would have left her to die. And though the road ahead was uncertain, one truth remained clear. Courage, compassion, and the choice to act, even when the world seemed indifferent, could carve hope out of the harshest land. The canyon lay quiet, the sun low, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the jagged rocks. The woman sat by the creek, her hands trembling as she cupped water to her lips. The cowboy stood nearby, eyes scanning the horizon, knowing that the desert had a way of hiding threats until it was too late. She looked up at him, strength mingled with fear in her gaze. "They'll come back," she whispered. "They won't stop until I'm dead." He nodded slowly, his face grim. "Then we make sure they don't." They rode at dawn, the morning light glinting off their worn saddles and the weapons at their sides. The cowboy led her to a narrow pass, where the desert funneled into a tight corridor of rock. It was a trap, but it was the kind of trap only someone who knew the land could use. They waited. Hours passed. The wind whispered through the rocks, carrying the scent of dust and danger. And then, far in the distance, the glint of metal and the hoofbeats of the returning men broke the silence. The scarred leader rode first, his eyes scanning, cocky, expecting an easy kill. But the canyon betrayed him. Rocks above and on either side provided cover, and the cowboy's patience was unmatched. Bullets flashed, kicking up dust and echoing off stone. The cowboy moved with precision, each shot finding its mark. The woman stayed low, her hands trembling, but her eyes sharp. She had learned in the hours of pain and fear that survival depended on watching, waiting, and striking only when necessary. One by one, the outlaws fell, the canyon swallowing their cries. The last man, the scarred leader, tried to flee, but the woman stepped forward, her own hand steady on the pistol she had taken from one of the fallen. "Your time's over," she said, voice steady, eyes fierce. He faltered, realizing that the girl he thought helpless was the one holding the power now. She fired. The shot echoed, final and absolute. The leader toppled, and the canyon fell silent once more. The cowboy approached her slowly, keeping one hand near his holster but seeing no threat. She lowered the pistol, breathing hard, but alive, victorious. "You did it," he said simply, admiration in his voice. She looked at him, eyes glistening with tears that were part relief, part triumph. "We did it," she corrected, "because you didn't leave me, because you carried me when everyone else would have let me die." The desert wind swept through the canyon, carrying dust and the faint scent of gunpowder. For a moment, the world seemed suspended, the violence behind them and the vast emptiness ahead. "Where will you go now?" he asked. I don't know," she admitted. "But I won't run anymore, not from life, not from them. I've survived. Now I'll live, and I'll make sure no one else suffers as I did." He nodded, tipping his hat. "Then live. That's all any of us can do out here." They rode out of the canyon together, the sun climbing higher, casting long shadows that would soon vanish. The desert stretched endless before them, a land of danger, of choices, of survival. And for the first time, it felt like hope. In the West, the weak die and the ruthless take what they can, but sometimes, a single act of courage, a single choice to stop and help, could change the course of lives. The cowboy and the woman disappeared into the horizon, two silhouettes against the rising sun. The wind carried their story through the canyon, whispering a lesson the West always knew: life, even in the cruelest land, could be claimed again by those brave enough to seize it.